All right. Excellent. So today is Wednesday, February 5th, 2025, and we are in the conference room of the Murphy Building on the St. Bonaventure University campus. I'm the interviewer, Amy Moritz, and I'm with MJ Telford, who played basketball at St. Bonaventure from 1971 to 1975. She became head coach in the summer of 1975, and in 1986 became the first full-time coach in any sport other than men's basketball at the university. She coached through 1993, finishing with 201 career wins. MJ, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thrilled to be here, Amy.
All right. So start with just tell me about where you grew up and when you first remembered falling in love with sports.
Well, I grew up in Madison, Connecticut, which is a beautiful town in the Connecticut shoreline, and the oldest of five. And I was very fortunate that the neighborhood that I grew up in had a lot of boys. And as I was young, I just enjoyed playing football or playing basketball or playing baseball, not softball because there were no women's sports really back then. That one of the big changes that we've seen over the years is the developmental programs for girls at a very young age. I mean, as we know, you go to any town now and there's little girls out playing soccer and lacrosse and basketball and all kinds of things. Back then, you played with your neighbors, you had recess at school, and you played in your own backyard. So it was very, very different. And I was fortunate. I had a dad who was very supportive and put up a basketball hoop for me, and I had a wonderful aunt, my Aunt Kay, who was a very good athlete. And so, she would help me with softball, and she would help me with basketball. So I loved it from the beginning. Grew up with it in the neighborhood, playing with the fellas, and fortunately, they let me play, and it kind of went from there.
And so how many sports did you play in high school?
Well, again, back then, I actually was the first woman to play 3 sports at our school because you didn't have a lot of programs. They had some tennis, they had basketball, they had field hockey. So I played field hockey, basketball, and then in my senior year, we had a softball team. So I played all 3 of those.
Right. And so then how did you end up at St. Bonaventure for school?
Well, as what's the case back then, we looked in the Peterson Guide in the guidance office, and there weren't a lot of college fairs back then, and so you did your own research, and a guidance counsel would help you. But St. Bonaventure was one of the schools that I was looking at, and I was very fortunate to have a number of choices, mostly in New England and a few in Pennsylvania. And believe it or not, I chose St. Bonaventure sight unseen. And so I truly believe, and this is going to probably sound a little goofy, but I truly believe I was meant to be at St. Bonaventure. We had no connections. It wasn't well known in back then in Connecticut. It was 10 hours away. Back then, Route 17 from Binghamton to St. Bonaventure was still a 2-lane Route 17. So I remember coming up with my aunt, and after I selected Bonaventure, and we kept saying, it must be over the next mountain. It must be over the next mountain. And, 10 hours later, here we arrived. But I was looking for a small school. I preferred a Catholic school. And I had been recruited by Southern Connecticut State University, who back then was a major program with women's basketball, but I didn't want to stay home. And so I came to Bonaventure for academics, not thinking athletics. And, that certainly was part of my career here, but it wasn't that I came up here and I was recruited or anything like that. It was totally an academic decision.
So when you were looking and when you came here, it was an academic decision, but were you thinking you wanted to play when you came here, or?
I did. I mean, it was, basketball and athletics was an important part of my life, and I did want it to continue. St. Bonaventure back then really had only a women's basketball program. That was the only women's program. Very embryonic. We played in Butler Gym. In 1959, they had the first women's team here, and they played mostly community colleges, Houghton, Niagara, Canisius, but certainly within an hour or two distance, and we're playing maybe 10 games a year. So when I came, they had a team, but very much kind of, I don't want to say we coached ourselves, but we were committed to playing, and it was a group of girls who wanted to play basketball, who wanted to improve the program. Sally Luna was our coach. She was the dean of women, and so she coached us, and we began kind of the same thing, had 10 or 12 games a year, and our home court advantage in Butler Gym was that we knew where the dead spots were in that bad floor. We knew where the nails were sticking up that would pop the basketball. And we knew when our fans came into the gym where it was slippery on the floor from their winter boots. So we played in Butler. There was never a thought that we would be allowed to play in the Riley Center. The women's swim team was newly developed during that time, and they swam in a dingy, small pool in the basement of Butler. So the same thing, our two programs, there was a beautiful pool in the Riley Center, which was a relatively new building then. In 1966 it was built, and this is, early 70s. But the women were not going to swim in the pool, and the women were not going to play on the Riley Center floor, at least not at that time.
Today we hear that story, and immediately, we want to be like, but the women should have equal access and have better facilities. Obviously, at the time, you knew, and the men's program had a big national profile during that time. But how did you feel? Like, what was there a sense that you wanted more resources, that you felt you were getting short shift, or was it just the way the time was, and so you didn't think about it as much?
Well, I think for St. Bonaventure, to put it in perspective also, we had always been a male university. We're founded in 1858, but in the early 1970s, that was the very beginning of women living on campus. Prior to that, women were enrolled at St. Bonaventure, but they were commuters, or they lived up at the Mother House, at St. Elizabeth Mother House. So until Laughlin was built, again in the mid-'60s, there were no women on campus. So the numbers were very skewed. Now, actually, there are more women at St. Bonaventure than there are men. But back then, it was very primarily a men's university. So we wanted to develop our program, but our expectations, I think, were limited. We knew that certainly it was not a priority, but I think we did our best to improve the quality of the program a little bit as best we could, but we weren't going to get more resources. It was like, the girls, give them a basketball and let them play a couple of games, and that was about it. And I'd say the 71 through 75 time period.
And can you you described a little bit what it was like playing in Butler. What was it like to be on that team? What were practices like? What were games like? Because for you guys, I'm sure it was very competitive and something you really worked on.
Yeah, I would say, just as you would expect in any program, whatever the level is, we were committed, and we worked hard, and we practiced hard, and we wanted to win. The level, because there was limited developmental programs, as we talked about, our level of play is certainly not what the level of play is in the 80s or the 90s or now. So as women had more opportunities to improve and had more coaching and had more strength training and all these different things, obviously the game has improved. But if you play and you're committed, you play hard and you want to win, whether it's 1975 or whether it's 2025. So I would say we had one uniform that we washed ourselves. We had, as I said, about 10 games that we played. We didn't have a bus. We had a van that we drove, that our coach drove. You didn't go out to dinner after a game. You just went up and played a game at Niagara and turned around and came home. There were no locker rooms. Butler was cold and not well lit, but that was our place. So that's what we did.
Right. And so you graduate in 1975. And what did you major in? What was your degree in?
Languages.
Okay. Did you ever intend to go into coaching?
I didn't. I was very fortunate, and I had some opportunities for jobs down in New York, but an admissions job opened up in the spring of my senior year, and I had a wonderful, happy experience at Bonaventure in every sense of the word. I loved it here. I felt it was a terrific place for somebody to grow up and somebody to get a quality education. So I wanted that admissions job because I wanted to tell everybody else, trumpet how great we were. So fortunately, I did get the admissions job. I started, my first day was July 5th, right after the holiday. And so my focus was admissions and helping the enrollment area. When I returned for this job, our coach that we had our senior year, who was Carolyn Schreiber. So we had Sally Luna for 3 years, and then Carolyn Schreiber was our coach senior year. She did not intend to be a long-term coach. She kind of filled in and coached. So there was an opening. And Larry Weesey, who at that time was our athletic director, contacted me and said, MJ, would you like to change from a uniform to a coach? So that's how I got the job.
Wow. And stayed there for, I knew you took 1 year off, right, to be full-time in admissions. Is that correct?
Well, what happened was I was, full-time in admissions, which involved a lot of travel. I was, my territories were down in Long Island and Connecticut and New Jersey. So in the fall, I was traveling a lot, and then again in the spring. But you fit in the basketball. So I was full-time admissions, part-time coach, which I always laugh because, again, if your heart's in it and you want to develop it, it's like 2 full-time jobs, but you love it. So for 11 years, from 75 to 86, I was in that situation. I was part-time basketball, full-time admissions. In 75 and 76, for 2 years, we were, and into 77, we were AIAW, which is basically a Division III equivalent. In 1977, we were awarded a few $500 two $500 scholarships. So I was, recruiting, and at that point you're looking for young ladies who want a very good education and who also want to play basketball. So what I was doing is using academic scholarships to bring in very good students who also happen to be very good basketball players to improve the program and develop our players. So in 1977, Lori Danielson and Karen Jesse were our first 2 $500 scholarship players. And but that's how we were building, and we were getting better. And our schedules were, we were doing a lot of different things to try to improve our scheduling, our recruiting, the teams that we played within that schedule. So we were trying to develop that program. So from 77 to 1986, we were Division II. And in the 85, 86, we were ranked in the East region of the NCAAs. We were ranked as high as 4th. The last year we were in Division II, which was 1986, we won the Upstate Basketball Conference Championship. Missy Ward was Player of the Year. Chris Agresta was on the first team, all conference. So definitely the ability of our players had increased. The quality of play had much improved. And so we kind of thought we were moving in that direction. The NCAA, at that time, schools could choose to have their elevated programs, their primary sports, one division, and their other sports, a different division. St. Bonaventure was exactly one of those. Men's basketball was, obviously a big, successful program, and they were Division I. All of our other sports, men and women, were Division II. The support for them reflected that financially, budget-wise, staffing, scheduling, everything. It was men's basketball at one level and everybody else at a different level. In 1985, the NCAA mandated that schools choose one division for all of their sports. So it wasn't a university choice. The university had to do that in order to maintain their men's basketball in Division I. So all of a sudden, our quote unquote, as we used to be called, minor sports, went Division I. That didn't mean that they got increased resources to go Division I. So in 1986, I was offered the women's basketball job full-time. I was at that point I was thinking, and the new director of admissions was a possibility for me, and I had to choose one or the other. And the basketball program was like my baby. I mean, we had developed it from this embryonic basis to a program that was pretty good. And so, of course, and I loved my team. I loved the women that were on my team, and I couldn't walk away from them. So I chose women's basketball and was the first full-time coach at Bonaventure other than the men's basketball coach. So our other sports, both men and women, still had part-time coaches. So 86, our team, everybody went Division I and into the Atlantic 10, which was a huge step for women's basketball.
There were, so I have a lot of questions about that.
Sure, sure.
There are advantages to moving up. A full-time coach, so you're able to focus on that. Mm-hmm. More scholarship money, as incrementally more. Were there also drawbacks, though, to becoming Division I and going into the Atlantic 10? Maybe not drawbacks, maybe more challenges that you had to overcome?
Well, actually, Amy, our scholarships were, when you mentioned we ain't got increased scholarships, very minimally. So I would say that, and Bonaventure wasn't the only school like this. We were mid-majors, and your Niagaras and your Canisius and your Providence, and a lot of the private Catholic schools or a Colgate or a Lehigh, those kinds of schools, they weren't going to put a lot of money or couldn't put a lot of money into all of a sudden these Division I programs that had been minor sports. One of the huge challenges for women's basketball at St. Bonaventure going into the Atlantic 10 in 1986, the Atlantic 10 women's basketball program was one of the top 3 in the nation. They had, and it's a very different Atlantic 10 than it is now. They had West Virginia, Penn State, Rutgers, Temple. They had huge programs, very successful programs. Penn State, Rutgers, and St. Joe's and Philly were perennial NCAA teams. They were ranked in the top 20 every year. West Virginia was in that. Temple was in and out of the top 20. So not only were you going Division I, you're going into this conference that has first team All-Americans, 3 Olympic gold medal coaches, Renee Portland at Penn State, Teresa Grentz at Rutgers, and Jim Foster at St. Joe's. So it was a major undertaking, and where we got some resources, those programs were all funded with 13 full rides and had been for a long time. They were all, well established, and so it was very exciting, but it was also very, very challenging, and we knew that we had an uphill battle, but we just dug in and did the best we can, and very frankly, I think that we were much more competitive right away than teams expected us to be. Part of that is we had Missy Ward, who is in our Hall of Fame. We had Chris Agresta, who is in our Hall of Fame. And as Division II players, they really were Division I players. And so we had the opportunity to have 2 legit Division I players in our Division II program. So that helped us with that transition. And then, we worked very hard to try to obviously recruit players that would be appropriate for that level. But, up to that point as a Division II, I was driving the van. We eventually got 2 retired gentlemen to drive 2 vans. That was a big deal. I had done all the taping. We had no trainer. My managers, who I loved and I was, beholding to all the time, they finally, we were doing laundry. Previous to that, the kids were doing their own, or I was taking it home. So that Division II, and I'm not griping about that, but that's just the reality of what it was. And as you coached, you knew that that's how it was going to be. Now going into the Atlantic 10, we had some elevation in resources, but we were certainly very lopsided in staffing, where we, our scheduling, money, our budget was very low. And our budget was lopsided from our men's, as was everything. Staffing, we didn't have a full-time secretary. We didn't have, we did our own publicity. Eventually, some of my wonderful interns, and you were one of them, helped with getting our media guides. But previous to that, it had been myself and my assistant, Randy Stabbins. So you could see a lot of differences that needed to take place, and some were more effective than others right away.
I want to go back to just that that Division II, and you win the Upstate championship, and have 2 players that were D1 quality, but playing D2. And while you're driving the van and doing a lot like those resources, there still was there support or a culture, because even with that, to have that success, you still need to have some sort of basis. So was there a culture or some sort of other support that you got that maybe wasn't monetary or financial, but that helped build that?
Well, yes, and that I felt was a big part of trying to build our program, was to try to, get community involvement or exposure of our program. So, but we had to be very creative in it. So, like, we would have double headers with the men, so that when the Rally Center filled with 5,000 people, when they came early, the women were playing. And then they'd say, that was exciting. I'm going to come a little earlier and watch the whole game instead of just the second half. We worked with the Rotary Club and volunteered to help with, their pancake breakfasts. And then they had our team to their dinners to be able to speak to the community. So you did some creative things along those lines. And it was just something that we we knew we needed to have people know about us. One of the things I did is our players didn't room together. And I felt a couple of reasons. I thought, well, okay, if you have a bad practice and coach was yelling at me, you can go home and tell a different person, your roommate, and you cannot like the coach for a night and come back to practice all happy. If you go home with the kid that was next to you getting yelled at, then you're both crabbing. But it also built our fan base. So the kids in the dorm knew our players. They lived in the dorms with them, and they were just students, but they came to our games. So that was another, I think, helped to put people in the stands. Our team they were good students. So faculty came because they wanted to support the good students that they had in their classroom. So those are the kinds of things, and even with our media guide, trying to do more with the media guide, and our the Olean Times-Herald was very supportive of us. Jim Malaro covered us, and we were good about calling in every game. Obviously, whether you lose or win, but sometimes people only call when they win. But giving them the story if it's an away game of what happened and how it happened and the statistics. So actually, we had stories of our games in the Olean Times-Herald for every game. And I find it a little disconcerting now. Here we have a Division I program, and we've had one for a long time. And there's usually very little in the paper about the women's program, about what they did last night. Tap into Olean does a nice job after every game. But so we did get again, community support because they were reading about us.
That's really interesting that, back in the 80s or the 90s, as you're going Division I, Atlantic 10, you're calling in and you're getting it written up. And now it's not, that coverage has kind of slinked away.
And I suppose part of that is, people aren't reading newspapers anymore. It's the whole, difficulty with communications and the different way that people communicate and get their news. But I just kind of find it, I'm still a newspaper reader, so when I go to the paper and I know they had a game last night and there's nothing in it today, it's like, oh. So that was really good for us, and the BV covered us. We had students cover us for the BV, and actually WSBU back then covered our games. Not all of them, but we did, as the years went on, we tried to get them involved and give them an opportunity for an internship and an experience, and then also, obviously, it promotes our program.
I'm curious, and I don't want to put you on the spot with this one, but
but you're going
it's not
to.
really on the spot. But as someone, I grew up in Buffalo in a Canisius men's basketball family. So
I won't hold that
That's
totally
a whole
against
nother story that we could talk about. Obviously, when you went to the Atlantic 10, that was different. You're not playing Canisius Niagara conference wise anymore. But I'm wondering about that rivalry with Canisius and Niagara and that Western New York kind of basketball rivalry and what you remember about it. Maybe even back as a player, or in those days, in those pre-Atlantic 10 days, about that. Was it intense?
It was very intense. The Little Three was a great, Little Three, and here we were, three very similar small Catholic schools facing the same challenges and competing for similar students. Yes, and I would say that it was something I really enjoyed. The coaches, I would have to say that the coaches at Niagara and Canisius and myself, that we were friends. And certainly that for those 2 hours we were bitter rivals, but it was a friendly rivalry. But it certainly was a highlight of who won the Little Three. You say it now and they don't even know what the Little Three is. And I get it. Think times have changed. But back then, not just for our program, but certainly for the men's basketball and all of our sports, the Little Three meant something. And we played in the odd. which was a big deal, but we were similarly financed. We were similarly staffed. Our students that we recruited were similar in ability. So I would say the thing about playing in the Little Three was it was a group of people that both players and coaches that were in the same realm of athletics. I think when you get into the Atlantic 10, then there's a real differential between a school with 30,000 students and a school with 2,000 students, and a budget of whatever and a budget of much less. But I would say that the memories of Little Three are very good memories. Whether we won or lost, it was always an enjoyable experience with them.
The women's basketball program has, they were the Bonnettes nicknames, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Bonnettes and the Lady Bonnies are the two that I remember before. I want to say it was mid-late 90s when gender-neutral nicknames. Everybody became the Bonnies, and that was a movement across the country,
Yes.
Really. So what were your thoughts about Lady Bonnies versus Bonnies back when that change was happening, and has your thinking on that changed at all?
I would just start off with that first team back in the 1959 and the early 60s were the Squaws. Yikes. But we were the Brown Indians, and they were the Squaws. So you can see where it came from. But then we were the Bonnettes when we were 75 to 77, and then we switched to the Lady Bonnies. I was a big proponent of Lady Bonnies because, again, we were trying to differentiate and have an identity for our program. And so even a headline would say, Lady Bonnies win. Lady Bonnies lose by 2. Where if it says Bonnies, they don't have room to say Bonnie women. So you have to read the article, or at least, glance down. So I felt that as we were trying to build this program and establish who we were and be very proud of who we were, I had terrific young ladies who came here to get an education, but also it was very important for basketball. I was proud of them. They did a lot of good things. 7 of them are in the Hall of Fame. But this was our program. So I would say I felt very strongly that it would be Lady Bonnies, and our gear, Lady Bonnies. When I left in '93, they were still Lady Bonnies. And as you said, shortly thereafter, because the Lady Lions from Penn State, so we weren't the only ones. Everybody was a lady, whatever your team mascot was, or most people. I'd say, around 95, I think it went kind of more neutral. I didn't like it at all for the reasons I just stated. I think for all the programs, you want your own identity. You want to get out of the shadow of the men. I still would prefer it because but I understand certainly that that's just the way it has changed, and I don't feel as strongly about it now one way or the other.
I think that branding, was a thing that people didn't think about, except for Pat Summitt,
Right.
who was not going to give up Lady Vols.
Mm-hmm. You're right.
And that was her thing, was marketing, and that culture. I call it culture, but that what you were building when those women come back to campus from 1995 earlier, they are Lady Bonnies through and through.
Yes, and last year, Sue Shea had her jersey raised to the rafters of the Riley Center, which was a very proud moment for her, certainly well deserved. It was a proud moment for me, and I still get goosebumps. But the Lady Bonnies came back for Susie. She was a beloved player. She, to this day, is certainly one of the most outstanding players we've ever had. But all the Lady Bonnies had their Lady Bonnies gear, and they came back and they had T-shirts on, and they had jackets on, and they had sweatshirts on, and loved every single minute of it. So yes, I think they have they're very proud. If you were Lady Bonnie, you were Lady Bonnie, and I have players who were Bonnettes, and they say it with a giggle, but they were Bonnettes and have been very supportive of our program because they understand those women who played in the 70s and the 80s and really worked hard to build this program, understand what we didn't have and where we have come despite some of those deficiencies. And I'm very proud of them and, really relied on their support. When you asked about support, our former players are very, have been very supportive of me through the years and our program.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, where your support came from, and obviously from players and from alumni, but where did you find some of the most support in your years?
Yeah, and it was former players who really wanted us to continue to grow and were proud of the advancements that we were making. I certainly would say that personally, Larry Ford, who was the director of the Riley Center at one point, the director of our ticket office, and I was very, very close friends, and director of personnel. So Larry and I went, he was ahead of me and older than I, but he was a wonderful best friend, and he was very supportive, and he would usually hear my complaints and see me crying or whatever I was doing when I was frustrated. So he was wonderful. Again, the students came out and were supportive of that. Larry Weesey, I had a very good relationship with Larry Weesey, who was our athletic director. And, when he'd see me coming towards his office, he knew I was coming in with, a plan or this is a resource that we need. His hands were tied. He didn't have the purse strings. He would go and ask for things, but we had a good understanding. He knew I was working hard to build our program, and I needed to come to him and talk to him about what we needed to do and what was lopsided and expectations that players should have. And we were able to get a trainer. I mean, that was very important. We got had a trainer finally. We shared a trainer with several other sports, but at least we had somebody besides me taping people. We got a locker room. So we made strides. But Larry and I have always had a wonderful relationship. I could get a little bit frustrated with him, and my little bit of my Irish would come out, and 5 minutes later we'd be walking down the hall, chit-chatting. So I was very grateful for that because that's not always the case.
Right, I was going to say, understanding that at a small school there were limited resources to begin with, but it also sounds, or from the stories I've heard too, that you've had, now we call them male allies, right? But you had men in those positions who were supportive as much as they fiscally could be, it sounds like.
Right. And Father Jim Toll was a vice president, and he did a lot with holding the purse strings. And I certainly, was friendly with Father Jim. But yes, I think, we, as with any place, and still now, if you ask any coach, there are resources that they feel that they should have that they don't, although we, as they say, we've come a long way, baby.
Yeah. I don't think there's ever a coach who thinks they have all the resources that they need.
Yes, I would say if that's the case, then you've stopped developing, you've stopped growing, you've stopped trying to improve, because you always think that there's more that you can do, and you need something else to help make that happen.
I know that we've talked about, finances and resources, but what an example or what was maybe a challenging time for you as an athlete or coach, and how did you work your way through that?
I would say that to start it with, I really I'm very, very grateful for the experience that I had here at Bonaventure as a coach. And I'm very proud of where that program came from and where it was when I left it. And certainly, when Jim Crowley took the team to the NCAAs, I mean, boy, that was very thrilling. So there have certainly been things that I'm very proud of. It took a lot of work, and not just me. I mean, it was my assistants, it was my managers, it was trainers, it was, certainly the players, support from parents. So, as they say, it takes a village to have that happen. But I would say that it was very challenging, that sometimes it was almost insurmountable, you thought. But you did the best that you could. I think that, we were much more competitive when we went into the Atlantic 10 than people expected us to be. And we were able to improve, and we were somebody that teams didn't take for granted. If Bonaventure was coming, we had a chance to beat anybody, except, I would say, Penn State. To be honest with you, we just didn't match up well with Penn State. They were big, they were fast, there were a lot of them, and Rini did a great job. But any other team on a given night, we were competitive. Were we quite there in some cases? No, but we certainly won in the Atlantic 10, and I was really proud of that.
You had mentioned the teams in the 2000s who got to the NCAA tournament. There was a team that went to, the Sweet 16. When you're watching that now, from the stands and as a fan, do you take some pride in knowing that's built on what you and your players created?
I certainly, I guess I would say I'm proud of that. I certainly recognize that is, Marty Whitmore came after me and Jim Crowley. So, I mean, that's what they did with developing that. But yes, I mean, there was a program when I left in '93. There was a very credible program with good players and with, the availability to say, okay, I think with hard work on their part, we can continue to move this forward and move it up.
You had mentioned, and we had talked a little bit about media coverage, but how important was that for the community and the perception of the program as you were building it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it worked two ways. We certainly felt that the student interns that we had that covered us, that we were very grateful that there was an interest from the BV staff to assign somebody to the Lady Bonnies. Eventually, we had somebody travel with us, Woj. So I think Woj, I don't know that I can say, well, the first Woj bomb was a big Lady Bonnie news, but Woj was a student intern for us for a couple of years, and he traveled on the road with us. Bob Beretta, our new vice president, he covered the Lady Bonnies at one point in his career. So it gave them experience in statistics and in writing the stories and in, kind of the human side of things, and because they saw us. It wasn't just show up at a game. So I think it was helping build their experiences as a journalist as much as it was really helping us to get the word out of who we were, who our players are, and even with some of the things that it would enable us to do with promoting our players in the Atlantic 10, promoting our players. When we were Division II, we had Missy Ward was an All-American, and they had sports information directors. It was COSITA. And so we had players that were listed as All-Americans or got, Player of the Month. And so those kind of promotions also for our players to have that recognition, but also to have our program have it.
This is always a hard question, so if you have more than one, but do you have a favorite memory from playing or coaching, or a few?
Certainly a few. I think that one that jumps out is when we were in the Atlantic 10, and we played St. Joe's down in Philly, and again, Jim Foster was an Olympic coach, and they had a couple of All-Americans, and we beat them at St. Joe's. Susie Shea had a fantastic game. They double-teamed her, and they couldn't stop her. And I do just, and I'll get back to that, so remind me what the question is, but I do want to say that Susie Shea is one of the best players, as I mentioned, that we've ever had. And what people don't realize is when Susie was here, she graduated in 92, so 88 to 92. We're new to the Atlantic 10. She's a 5'10" power forward that other schools overlooked. I'm very glad to say that. Who was double teamed by 6'2" All-Americans, whether it was Rutgers, St. Joe's, West Virginia, and teams couldn't stop Susie. And now we also had a very complimentary group of players, and I don't mean that that they were lesser than Susie, because Jody Urich could shoot, and Beth Gromowitz was very quick, and so each one had their own job to do on the floor, and they did it. But teams prepared to stop Sue Shea. So when Susie had her records of points and rebounds and scoring, she was the third leading freshman scorer in the country against Atlantic 10 competition. That is no small accolade. She deserved it, but we didn't have 13 full rides. We had a couple of full rides, and we're playing against Atlantic 10 teams that had 13 full rides. So as we were building, even when I left, we still, were nowhere near what the other teams had. But people don't realize that about Susie. And I guess I just wanted to take this to tout her. And she was the hardest working, she had a lot of friends. She's a terrific, humble human being. So, and I had a lot of wonderful players, women, who were like Susie. Mm-hmm. So that was one happy memory, and Susie had a wonderful game. I'd have to say that another happy memory was, when we went Division I, and I got named a coach. It was a very special day for me. But I really was always so proud of when our players would get accolades, and whether it was an academic award here at Bonaventure, they used to give Letterman of the Year, and there were a number of awards that they got here, and the Lady Bonnies inevitably were getting that. The fact that there's 7 of my players in the Hall of Fame, I'm very proud of that, and it makes me happy. Trying to think of some other. I'm sure I'll think of some, but the Upstate Championship, when we, it was our last year in Division II, and we had to win our last game of the season in order to clinch the championship. It was very tight. It was Niagara and ourselves that were on that last day of the season. Whoever was going to win the championship, and our players. We won here at home, and Niagara lost, and we won the championship. So that was a really happy day for us. We had an exciting game against Mary Biasotti, hit a shot at the buzzer for us to beat West Virginia. We were down 1, and Kristen DeLuca inbounded from the other end of the court. Kristen Knopper caught it. Very fortunately, Kristen quickly gave it to Mary Biasotti, because Kristen was 6'3", non-dribbling center. Passed it to Mary Biasotti, a freshman, who hit a baseline jumper, and we win. That was, I think a lot of Lady Bonnies would say that was one of their favorite games and a happy memory. And I will say a day that was very special to me is when Steve Watson called to say that I was being inducted into the Hall of Fame, and I cried, because I never thought that would happen. So that was a very special day for me.
Yeah. special day for a lot of people to have that happen. For sure. What is one thing or a few things that you'd want people to know, remember, or understand about St. Bonaventure women's basketball and its history, where it came from?
Well, I think I want them to know that it took a lot of terrific, dedicated women who played for us to help improve this program and put in a lot of hours and not necessarily get the recognition they deserved, and had some of the frustrations, but had a wonderful experience. But they're the ones that built this program. People like yourself, my managers. I used to always say, okay, whatever my manager tells me to do, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to be there, because you were the lifeblood. You, Maureen Shanahan. I won't name all my managers because I know I'll forget somebody, but they were very important because they took a load off of what I used to have to do, and they were very committed, and they put in actually longer hours than my players sometimes because they had to be at practice earlier. They stayed later, and they were doing things that, were behind the scenes that nobody gave them credit for. So I think it's one of the things that it took a lot of people, and my administrators who were supportive, and I don't mean to say that they weren't, but it was a limited, and we realized some of the limitations that we had. But it was a wonderful experience. The people that I met, the players, and I'm still close to a lot of players. It means a lot to me that we keep in touch, and when we see each other, lots of stories come out. And there's usually a couple of stories I've never heard before, and we laugh about that. But it was a wonderful experience, and I'll say it was. When I left in '93, I was fired. And obviously that was heartbreaking for me. I was devastated. But as I look back at it, I left Bonaventure. I was a guidance counselor for Native Americans for 2 years. And then I was a principal here at Archbishop Walsh in Olean for 3 years. But fortunately, and I felt this was a real blessing, the people at Bonaventure were always supportive of me. I never lost my friends. I maintained the relationships. I still was down here. And that's not always the case when you're fired. And it came back full circle because Bob Wickenheiser, who was president, called me when I was principal at Walsh and said, would you come back to St. Bonaventure? That was one of the happiest days of my life, to come back to the place that I loved. I was in advancement from 2000 to 2006. Then Sister Margaret, who was the president, asked me to come back to admissions, which was another very happy day in my life. And so I was able to, even though I left Bonaventure at a time that I didn't expect to, my life came back to Bonaventure, and I was able to have, I always tell people, I had 34 happy years here, and I hope I, made a few contributions. And the students, not just student athletes, but the students and families that I met through admissions and the different jobs that I had, I still see them at, they come back for games, and I see them and they see me, and it's very special. So I'm very grateful for the experience and the career that I had at St. Bonaventure and all the people that helped make it so special for me.
That's great. Is there anything we didn't talk about that you'd like to mention?
I don't think. I guess I would say that another part of the university or part of the history is after I was fired. A couple of promises that were made to me were not fulfilled. And after a great deal of heartbreak and deliberation and some praying, I sued the university for Title IX. and an EOC regulation. The good news, bad news is I had kept a lot of records that were, they weren't private records. I didn't do anything that they weren't supposed to be out there, but I had records of, my budgets versus the men's budgets, staffing. And so when I sued the university, it was mostly because I wanted the program to continue to grow. And there was no doubt that we were not in compliance with equity for Title IX. And just before, in 95, just before we were going to go to trial, the university settled. And that's when the women's program here got their full complement of scholarships and their coaching staff and salaries. I mean, salaries that I could never have imagined. And opportunities to recruit on a wider basis and travel for games on a wider basis. So it was very, very difficult, but I felt I had to do it too. This program that was nothing, and then it could be even more that for the future program that happened, and it worked out all right.
So sometimes that an example of that challenging time to go through because you want something better at the end of it,
right,
for other people.
Yeah, it wasn't for me. I just felt that, okay, this program that so many people had worked so hard to bring to this level, there was an opportunity to bring it to the next level, and if I didn't take that opportunity, it wasn't going to happen. So when I saw, for instance, the team that was so successful for those few years going to the NCAAs, you kind of thought, okay, well, I guess it helped a little bit, that they were able to take those resources and work very hard and become successful. So,
did it feel like, looking back? So the mid '90s is when I was a student here. That it was in danger. Danger might be too strong of a word. I'm not talking specifically necessarily about St. Bonaventure, but that, like, women's basketball, there was a chance where any of that progress, and you went to Division I, and then it kind of felt maybe that people got blasé about supporting, or maybe not.
I don't think I ever felt that. And I think part of it is, if you look again back into the development of the young kids, that these fourth graders are running around in little uniforms, and they're all going to camps, and they have people who are qualified coaches, and so they're developmentally way, way ahead of anything that you would ever expected, and that's never going to change. To be honest with you, I think sometimes it's gotten to be a little overboard. One of the differences, we used to be a three-sport athlete. And so you'd have different coaches, you'd have different teammates, you'd have different success levels of, whether your basketball team was real good and your softball team wasn't so great, whatever it might be. So it was a real different type of growth and experience for both boys and girls, but now you're a one-sport athlete, and I think kids get burned out. Injuries can come into that just from fatigue with as they grow. When I was here, we started the softball team in 1981, and most of the softball players were Lady Bonnies. But I didn't have a problem with that because we were trying to help develop that. And I had very good athletes, and they wanted to play. And I wasn't going to stop them from playing. But it's very seldom now that a coach will let somebody be a multiple sport athlete or a parent. And so I'm not sure that that's the healthiest thing for young people as they're growing, especially when they're young, and you're not going to go, play college ball or whatever. I think it's great to be able to be a little more broad in your opportunities and your experiences.
Yeah. So last question, you had mentioned Suchet, when she had her number retired, and so many people, they came back, the Lady Bonnies came back. There's that, it goes over years, but it feels like the alumni, the former Lady Bonnies or Bonner women's basketball, wherever they fell, or Bonnettes, there's a very tight bond that they maintain with their teammates. What do you think it is? What is it? Is it just something about being on a team in general? Do you think that it's something about the experience at St. Bonaventure?
I think St. Bonaventure has a lot to do with it because, our players, as well as most of our students, especially back in those days, they lived on campus. They all went to the same dining hall. They were in classes together. So there was a bond that they built amongst themselves. I think that, the continuity that I was here 18 years, so whether they like it or not, they had the same coach. And like Randy Stebbins was here for a number of years. So I think we had continuity in our program. And I also think that, as I said, they knew what the others went through to help make their experience better. So the people that were in the 80s are grateful to the Mimi McDonalds and the Mary Riches and the people that were in the late 70s and finally got to wear sneakers that the school bought for them instead of go out and buy some sneakers at Walmart. So I think that the experience at Bonaventure, because of who Bonaventure, what kind of school Bonaventure is, and the Franciscans, I think, the fact that what our values are here and service to others and caring about other people, that's part of being on a team too, and supporting people. Joy Kwasniak played for me, and Joy didn't play much. And she worked really, really hard in practice, and she really, really pushed Melissa Jarecki, who was ahead of her. But as Melissa got better, because Joy was pushing her, Joy wasn't making any progress and getting any minutes. And she was the most wonderful, supportive, positive player that a coach could ever want. Never complained, wanted to get in a game and was competitive, but knew what her role was. And I was a coach that I tried to get players in when we were in a game that they should be able to play in. And not just in the last 2 minutes to wipe up, to get in there for 3 or 4 minutes and give somebody a rest when it's a 12-point game. It doesn't have to be a 30-point game. And everybody has their own philosophies on that. But I think that helped our players know that if they worked hard, they would be, I don't want to say rewarded, but they would earn playing time as best as I could get them in there. And that was an important philosophy for me.
All right. Well, MJ, thank you so much.
Amy, I'm thrilled. Thank you for asking me, and I think this is a wonderful project that you're embarking on.